Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I am unbelievably thrilled today to bring you the inaugural episode of the Business Integrity Innovations. I am incredibly passionate and fired up about this podcast series. You're going to hear stories of innovation, you're going to hear stories of ethics, you're going to hear stories of compliance that literally you have never heard before. And we're going to bring you in this series sponsored by Ethics First. Stories from the African subcontinent around business ethics, ethics first, compliance and ethics. And we're going to start today with Andrew Wilson, the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE. I'm going to be joined throughout this journey by Lola Adekanye. And Lola, I'm going to ask people or ask you to explain, why are you men's ethics first?
That's a good one. That's a good one, Tom. So, I guess listeners want to find out why. I think let's talk about the title of the podcast, right? Business Integrity Innovations. And the podcast is inspired by a really interesting solution that CIPE launched in 2020. I'm not going to give too much away, but that solution is called Ethics First. I work with just a phenomenal team across different departments within SIPE and with you as well, Tom, as an advisor to this program. And I think just being able to support this program and sort of selling it and talking about it has probably made people forget my name and just call me Miss Ethics First, right? But I think we all are. We all should be Miss and Misters and whatever it is, Ethics First. But enough about us, right? I'm just as excited about getting into the details of this podcast with no other person than Andrew Wilson, SIPE Executive Director. So let me turn it to you, Tom, to introduce our guest.
Sure. Andrew, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and your role at CIPE and explain to us really what CIPE is and why you're able to bring through the center the initiatives that you are. Could you tell us about a little bit about your professional background, the roles you've held at CIPE, your current role, and then turn to CIPE itself?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Lola. And really is a pleasure to join you on this inaugural broadcast. And like you, I'm looking forward to hearing the stories from the field. If there's one thing that I've always spoken to my colleagues here at SIPE about, it is my favorite part of the job is the learning aspect of it, and the ability to hear the voices from around the world that brings such new and fresh insights and knowledge. And the career development advice I often give people is, look, when you don't learn anything more from a job, it's time for you to move on to somewhere else. And I've been here at site now for 28 years and I'm still learning things and it's still a joy to be part of this. And certainly this journey on anti-corruption and this work with our local partners is both inspiring and also educational. And I hope it's for our listeners as well. As I just mentioned, I've been at SIPE for 28 years. I'm SIPE's executive director, but I having been at a place for so long means that you get to wear pretty much every hat and do every job around the place. And that's been my story here as well. I started off here at SIPE as a program officer, working on our programs at a very interesting time, which was the time that the political and economic transition in the former communist countries of Eastern Europe was happening. And I was proud to be part of that effort back then. And as my career evolved here at SIPE, began working in other regions of the world as well, the former Soviet Union, and then into South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, a lot of very interesting places. Um, and throughout all of that, one of the constants, frankly, of our work when we would talk to our business partners and our business colleagues around the region was anti-corruption or the problems with corruption as a business operating environment and how we might be able to address that. And we can get into that in a later question. But really, that has been a, sort of a key theme moving forward. And the different ways we've thought about how we address corruption has evolved over the time, too. CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, is a nonprofit, and we were established 40 years ago out of an initiative of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So our roots are in the private sector. We were a private sector born organization, but also our roots we're in the politics of the time, if you will, back in the 80s, and part of a broader initiative of the Reagan administration, who thought that the US was doing a lot at that time to fight communism around the world, but doing very little to promote the values of democracy and support people around the world who shared our values. So we weren't going out there with a heavy hand saying, you have to do democracy. What we were doing, we're finding friends and partners and allies around the world who shared the same passion about the issues we shared. And our role really at CIPE is to support those voices around the world as they fight their own battles, if you will, for better ethics, for better business practice, for better governance around the world. We're an ally for people out there, and we do that in a number of different ways. When I first started off at CIPE, we were really just a grant making organization. And we provided a lot of direct financial support to business associations and civil society groups and think tanks about looking at the business environment in a country. And that's where our departure point is, I think, from a lot of development organizations over the years. CIPE focuses on the environment that businesses happen in. And we understand that businesses and their activities often are, if you will, a consequence of the environment they're forced to function in. And that for instance, in anti-corruption, no one wants to participate in corruption. But I think if your environment forces you to do so, you are an unwilling participant. And so a lot of our solutions really focus on helping both address the business environment to reduce that sort of scope for corruption, but then to help businesses cope with that, both internally and externally in that regard. And again, we can get to that later. But the DNA of CIPE and the DNA of our approach was always and has always been based in understanding the business environment, whether it's one that affects corruption or one that affects your ability to compete or one that might affect your ability to comply with regulations. But whatever that business environment is, we look at this as saying, if we can understand what shapes a business environment, where the problems are coming from, then we can start looking at how we can work with the local business community to advocate for the policy changes and for the regulatory changes and for the little things that shape the everyday actions of our partners. And by the way, our partners tend to be the small and medium enterprises around the world. It's helping the little guy get a better and more competitive foothold. That's our passion at CIPE. And that's kind of in our DNA as well. And it's really empowering the voice of those small and mediums around the world to participate in their own policy environment. And ultimately, that's what helps us achieve our mission of building the linkage between economic growth and economic reform and economic performance and democracy. Business does better in a democracy, and democracies do better when they've got a thriving private sector.
Indra, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I literally stumbled upon CIPE and why I was so excited to work with you. I come out of the energy industry. And in the first decade of this year was a large number of corruption enforcement actions, FCPA actions in the energy industry. And what I saw was after enforcement was a huge industry response, meaning that the top companies had gold standard compliance program. There were 4 service companies that did the work for those operating companies. And literally, if you wanted to do work anywhere in the supply chain, in the energy space, you had to do business ethically and in compliance, and you had to have an auditable compliance program. In the first year or two of the second decade of this century, I somehow found out about CIPE. And I thought, this is brilliant because this is the implementation of the business solution, what I try to focus on, the business solution to corruption. And you're creating a set of African partners for Western businesses with the same values, but the same business processes and the same thought and way that you want to do business. So this, to me, was absolutely brilliant of bringing the private enterprise component into this so that you could partner, Western companies would have a partner on the African continent, as I said in my opening remarks, who wanted to do business in the same way, but they wanted to have the same business processes And so we could pair up to fight this international scourge. Would that be consistent with sort of what you see from the site perspective?
Yeah, but you know what? It hasn't always been that way, and I think you're right to sort of think back and things like the extractive industries transparency work and other things that really were sort of the groundbreaking stuff. But if I think back to when 30 years ago, when we started looking at these corruption issues and trying to figure out the solutions, that stuff didn't really exist, right? If we tried to have a dialogue with the private sector or try to build capacity on the private sector, there weren't these joint standards. There weren't a lot of things, and there was some factors I think that sort of built that. We kind of when we first started doing anti-corruption work, the popular approaches were the name and shame NGO led, for lack of a better term, kumbaya kind of thing, where there was a lot of kind of feel good. We're all going to fight corruption together, and somewhat perhaps naive attitude that if we just got people angry, their behavior would change and that we would unite. But I think a lot of people, especially those who weren't in the private sector and who weren't on sort of the front lines of this, didn't really understand that there were some really complex business issues swirling around this. And it wasn't just about singing kumbaya, but it was like, how do I build the systems inside my company? How do I look at this as an issue? So when we first started working at this, we would show up and we'd sing kumbaya, but when we would turn around and talk to our partners in the private sector, they would just sort of shrug and say, "What do you want me to do with this?" Because my day-to-day reality is very different. And I'm dealing with local actors who don't sing kumbaya, who have very mercenary attitudes towards what I do. And frankly, I've got competitors who are willing to play that game. And if I don't play that game, I can't compete and I won't be in business. So let's get real. And I think we were kind of faced with that. And we took a couple of tacks on that. And our first tack was to say, okay, what can we do about changing the business environment, as I mentioned earlier? We can advocate this, and we can advocate maybe better public procurement or more transparent this or more transparent that in the public sphere. And I think that bears fruit, but sometimes you're nibbling around the edges of an issue without looking at it holistically. And while we could sort of make some inroads, what it came down to was for sometimes the folks on the public sector side and those who wish to cooperate with them on the private sector side were more creative in getting around what we were trying to do than we were in trying to propose solutions. So what we really had to get to, I think, was making a convincing business model as to why this stuff made sense. And I think a couple of things happened. And you alluded to it earlier, Tom, in the energy sector transparency work, was two things happened. One, globalization. There was always a split in global economies between sort of the standards that the multinationals wanted to ascribe to that were being told they needed to comply with and the interests of the local private sector. And you could play that in any sort of way you wanted to. You could play that in the realm of anti-corruption, or you could play that in the realm of regulation or business support or whatever economic policy a government was coming up with. But there traditionally was a split between the foreign investment community, if you will, and the local business community. Their interests rarely aligned. And so you didn't have the same hymnal that the private sector could sing from in that regard. Globalization started to break that down because what happened was that leading elements of the local private sector were starting to understand that the nature of engagement with the global private sector was changing. That we weren't just talking about some big FDI project coming in and doing a greenfield investment. What we were talking about was joining a supply chain, joining a value chain, being part of something bigger. And when FDI started, didn't really pan out, especially in an African strategy. The big FDI never really showed up. We kept promising it, but it never showed up. But these partnerships were starting to emerge. If you wanted to join an energy supply chain, if you wanted to join a food supply chain, if you wanted to do this or that, those were where the opportunities were for medium-sized businesses to start joining the global economy. So globalization started to develop in that way. The other piece of this, again, which you've alluded to, was the development of international laws and standards that started to see supply chains as the tool through which this action could actually meet traction on the ground. And what we saw was, if you will, the expansion of the rule of law via these tools into emerging markets. FCPA is probably the best example of this, but we've got, if you will, copycat laws in almost any country now, UK anti-bribery, et cetera, et cetera. But what we saw was lawmakers and regulators in OECD countries starting to look at how their laws could extend beyond the border, and how how American regulators could start to influence the business activities of not just American companies, but any company that touched the borders of the US or flowed through our economic or our banking systems or any other way. It's a very creative bit of lawmaking, frankly, and how that could extend into emerging markets, and how that could extend into value chains. And all of a sudden, that confluence of interests started to occur. And that was sort of the trigger moment, if you will, where the business case for ethics, the business case for compliance started to emerge. And we saw demand start to increase. And no longer, when we were in a seminar and showing up and trying to talk to the business community about singing Kumbaya, we could say it's great to sing Kumbaya, but hey, look at what the energy industry is doing. Look at what the food industry is doing. Look at what other industries are doing, the automotive industry, other things are starting to do in that. The other piece, and I'm kind of getting long-winded about this, but the other piece that was really important were things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Because the other strand that was happening within the anti-corruption movement was this idea of collective action and the need to develop models for collective action. And back in the 90s and into the noughts, there was a lot of talk about the need for collective action, but there was little in the way of example or quantitative impact that we could start looking at and learning from. And I think EITI was a real groundbreaker in that, because what it did is it built industry standards. It explored the linkage between governance and industry, and it came up with a practical model on how it could work. And it realized that the downstream supply chain was also going to be just as important a component of this as the sort of top line stuff. It was a very sophisticated approach that gave us, those of us who wanted to develop models on collective action, an idea of how we might make this work.
So, Lola, I'm going to pitch it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, as Andrew was talking about this, it was interesting thinking about a blog I wrote a few years ago that was titled Compliance Diplomacy, right? And it was really talking about how the FCPA, especially when it started getting enforced more actively, was a game changer for how anti-corruption compliance was talked about in the region, in Africa. I think around 10 years ago, most companies that knew about anti-corruption compliance knew about it because they did business with a US company, and the US company had to comply with the FCPA. And so it was easy for us to make the business case for them because they were connected in that way. But if we asked them about the local anti-corruption laws, they knew much less about it. And there are more companies doing business in many of the countries we work within the region in, or work with in the region, that may never be in direct contact with a US company. But every time we support partners and do a survey and ask, what are your challenges with the business environment? Corruption was always like maybe top 3, at the very least top 5. And trying to figure out how to rally the local business communities, I think, was the next thing for us. And Andrew, you just hit the nail on the head talking about the collective action models that started to engage local actors. EITI started to exchange local civil society organizations, regulators, and that way we're reaching more businesses in the business community. And so it's not only those businesses that are maybe the 10 or 20% that are in the value chain of large multinationals, but now even the third tier businesses in those spaces are starting to speak the same language and say, how do we even learn about this thing? But I think what I was going to ask about to learn from, because this is a program that drew my attention to CIPE. So speaking of how Tom discovered CIPE, this is how I discovered CIPE, and CIPE became home for me. It was reading about what I think was the first private sector collective action program that was quite remarkable. And that's the Thailand Collective Action Against Corruption program that was led by our Asia team. John Morrell was regional director at the time. I read about it and I thought, wow, this is different. And this could be a game changer. And I reached out to Morel and I said, I need to know more about CIPE. Can we try test some of these ideas in Africa? And he said, we're talking about ISO 3701. The anti-bribery systems program was just launched at the time. And he said, we're talking about it at CIPE. I'm moderating. Come and listen. And I want you to meet the regional director of Africa, Lars Benson. And the rest is history in the making now. But I thought that was remarkable. This program is what, 15 years old or more?
Yeah.
But I wasn't at CIPE when it started. I'm so curious to know I'm sure when it started, we couldn't see the end from the beginning. So we weren't sure how it would go, but I'm so eager to know, how did that start? What were the teething problems and what were the success factors? Because we're still learning from that program with Ethics First and many other programs in Europe, Eurasia that CIPE is implementing.
I think the grassroots of this one, again, are in the approach about working with a local partner and the importance of local ownership of these ideas. And in this case, the local partner was the Thai Institute of Directors. So it was an organization that was already working with the business leadership of the country at a corporate director level, right? These are the people who could lead change within an organization. And I think that was a fundamental starting point. Um, a lot of anti-corruption interventions prior to that were targeting managers and senior managers within an enterprise, but they weren't talking to the board. And so you had a lack of board leadership that could then influence the managers to actually implement the change and give them the support they needed to do the work they needed to do. So we've been doing a lot of work, and a lot of our sort of intro work or parallel work with this was in corporate governance and corporate governance standards. So we've been working with the Thai Institute of Directors on corporate governance standards for Thai companies. And as such, had a strong partnership there, but we also had an in with the stock exchange in Bangkok. And through that relationship, we had entree with the business leadership of the country. And I think this is really important when we talk about the approach to collective action is that it's the supply chains are an incentive, but the other big incentive is what are my competitors locally doing and how can I compete with them? And so what we learned through the Thai program was essentially they said, let's work through the stock exchange. Let's work through the listing requirements and other aspects of this to try and get company as an education tool to try and get companies to buy into this. And what we saw was a core group of companies, a very small group of companies beginning to say, you know what? We see the value in corporate governance. We see the value in internal controls as good business practice. And we want to make that part of how we do business. And then the stock exchange said, well, you know what? If you do that, we'll recognize you. We'll salute you as solid practitioners in this. And at the beginning, it was a feel good program. It was, we'll applaud you and we'll give you recognition. And that's how it started. So the stock exchange would do an annual lunch and all these good folks would get recognition, but their peers started to see this happen. And what the company saw was that they were seeing not only a reputational benefit from it, but they were starting to see performance benefits from it. And what we saw was in the condition, let's say, of a local auto parts manufacturer, it actually started to pass on these requirements down its supply chain, saying, we're a practitioner of this. If you're supplying us, we'd really like to see you do that. So it wasn't, we're not going to do business with you, but there was a bully pulpit that started to emerge. And then as the program developed, what we saw was the idea being, okay, how do we move beyond the kumbaya? How do we move on to something that's more solid and critical? And that's when we saw the introduction of different tiers, different standards, different layers of practice, and different layers of recognition. And I think ultimately what this came from is companies that were really implementing anti-corruption standards within the firm and that could prove it through their annual audit, where the auditors would come in and say, yes, they're actually doing what they claim to be doing. They've taken the pledge, but they're actually walking the walk. I mean, they're walking the talk. We can certify that. And the stock exchange in itself began to recognize that as these are top tier companies and top tier performers. So there was a real business incentive for that. And we're at a point now where a high percentage of companies that participate in terms of capitalization on the Thai stock exchange are participants within this program. So you've really generated local business leadership and local business ownership of this process that has had a really strong effect. And I think has affected the ethics first approach as well.
Absolutely. In fact, I was gonna say, maybe Andrew, just tell us about ethics first. But you see, the description that you've given for the Thai CAC is essentially the ethics first model. So for listeners who wanted to learn about ethics first, in that story, you've heard the progressive approach for companies to fix their corporate governance standards and business integrity systems, and then the incentive, which is recognition, but also there's healthy competition happening too. Okay, so I think we're coming up on time, Andrew, and I think we have so much more to talk about. But just to come back to ethics first and
Sure.
ask a
Well,
question.
maybe we can do
Yes,
a part one and a part two out of all of this. Um,
I think so. I think so. But the question is this. So now you saw the Thai model, and of course, ethics first is learning, has learned a lot and built on this knowledge from the Thai model. And my every day I'm taking notes about one thing. What are the success factors? What are the what's the appeal for this that would keep it going and make it successful? And I already took a note for one of the things that you talked about, which is business leadership driving this is critical. Business leadership on the ground and their connection with governance institutions. But if you were to give me two or three more success factors from watching the Thai CAC project grow, what will they be?
I think that if we're looking at this from an external perspective, I think the main success factor is seeing how a company moves through the tiers of the process. And ethics first, I think it has adapted this as well in having its tiered system. So it doesn't set unreasonable expectations for companies, but it gives them a path to recognition. And it understands that change management within a firm is complicated as it is in any environment because it's not just about putting in place the internal systems, but it's also putting in place a value system, which takes time and effort to sustain within the organization. So it's recognizing that there are technical elements to this, that there are values-based elements to this, and then frankly, there's the market reward element to this, which is a lagging indicator, right? No one's going to give you money up front to do the right thing. You're going to see that on the back end. And so it's important, I think, for efforts like Ethics First to bring companies through a process where you start off by saying, at a baseline, this is good practice. And this is where how companies can look at this and how they can sort of take the pledge and how they can build the systems. And this is what systems might look like in different size firms or different levels of education. And you've taken the class, right? And so you know it. The second level might be more along the lines of, okay, you've got a baseline of knowledge. You've come to church, if you will. You've heard the gospel. You've come to Jesus, if we want to extend that metaphor. But what do you do with it now? And how do you put that into practice? How do you live the life? And so at that stage is sort of the second stage, right? It's like, okay, I want to put this into my business. I want to understand what systems I'm creating and how I'm doing this, and I'm going to start actually implementing this inside my firm. And then the third level really is about how do I demonstrate externally that I'm doing this, and how do I start showing this externally, and what's my role, frankly, as a member of the business community in demonstrating this to others as well through my audit, through my work with creditors, through my work with my supply chain and other things. And I think recognition at every stage, the big takeaway here is you've got to recognize everybody at every stage and you've got to keep that sort of incentive model moving. So as people go through this, they can do this. We put a lot of emphasis on certification and some sort of external model. And I think we've looked at those different examples around the world of people who try to do certification on this. This model of self certification, if you will, to standards, we feel is probably a more realistic approach for a lot of firms in moving forward. It's practical. It's based on their business model. It's based on a lot of other factors that are within the control of the firm. And this tiered model gives companies the time they need and the skill sets to acquire the skill sets and to put things in practice. And it allows them to benchmark themselves at sort of at a pace that they can handle. And ultimately, it's getting to getting to the top gold standard of recognition and self certification that then allows you to, I think, to then start to attract the capital and the interest to get the reward. That's that lagging indicator. What we really need to focus on, and I think what the Thai Institute has done is the other takeaway, is that they not only do they celebrate, but they showcase. This company did well from this process, and you can do well too. They're actually showing there is a bottom line impact. So it gives people the incentive to do the work to work through that tiered approach.
So, Andrew, the tiered approach that you just articulated with our gold, green, silver, and gold standard really, I think, is a great incentivization for companies and a way to think through how someone from the outside who may look at companies as potential business partners can see their maturity level in this arena, and they can choose to help. They can choose to participate. They can choose to bring additional resources, or they could choose to maybe go with literally the gold standard. And really, from the business perspective, once again, I think that's a great way to think through all of this. Unfortunately, we are here now at the end of our time. And Andrew, I wanted to thank you so much. This has been a fabulous first episode of Business Integrity Innovations. And on behalf of Lola, I'm going to say we are definitely going to have you back.
Part two.
Anytime. I love talking about ethics first, and I love talking about anti corruption. So I'm always a willing participant.